CPD virtual training event aimed at teachers and assessors of the Education and Childcare T-level. And if you haven't already done so, please pop something into the question box. Let us know you can hear us. We are recording the event today and it will be available to all staff on our YouTube channel. We've also put the presentation as a PDF into the handout section. So if you'd like to follow the presentation, you can do. Brilliant, thank you. So my name is Helen Scanlon and I work in the NCFE's Provider Development Team. I've been supporting staff involved in Education Childcare T-level since May 2020. You can see the objectives of today's session on the screen now, and it should last approximately 60 minutes. We're going to be using polls and questions to involve you in the session activities. And we're also going to focus on the summative assessments for the technical qualification of the Education and Childcare T-level. And we're joined today by the Sector Manager for Education and Childcare, Janet King. Hello, Janet. It's great to have you here and your specialist knowledge. Is there anything particular you'd like to say about today's subject or topic today?
Hello, Helen, and thank you. And hello to everybody on the webinar as well. I think it's about considering some obvious differences really in the assessment processes. When we think about some other technical qualifications, such as the early years educator, for example, then we're thinking about those modular assessments. We're moving now towards that linear approach, and a combination of external and internal is now being replaced by summative external. But also, I think it's important when we're thinking about preparing, well, two things. A, the exams have been rare, have they not? And also about heightening the role of formative assessment for preparation and how revision of that knowledge and understanding can really benefit from engagement with practice questions, have a real understanding of those command verbs, think about time management, reflection, exploration, have a bit of a scheduled approach to this, and the different types of questions, skills and techniques that are required in a summative assessment process. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thank you. So we're going to start off today's session with a poll to assess your starting points. Please let us know how confident you are currently in relation to preparing your students for the T-level core assessments, the exams and the employer set project. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, where would you currently put yourself, please, before we start today's session? I'll launch the poll now. If you could choose the number that you feel best represents where you feel at the beginning of the session. Do you feel not very confident or extra confident? Wonderful, thank you to those who've voted already. So I'll just keep that open a bit longer to let everybody vote. Wonderful, we're at 89%, so thanks for that. We're nearly there, 95%, wonderful. Okay, thanks for that. Wonderful. So we've got a range. We have nobody at 9 to 10, so we're on a mission now to get people right on that top level. We do have some at 1 to 2. The majority of people are sitting in the middle, around 5 to 6. So lovely, thanks for that. Hopefully this session today will help improve your confidence in relation to the exams and the employer set project for the Education Childcare T-level. Okay, just a quick reminder about assessment and how it can inform and guide teaching and learning activities. It's really important that for T-levels that we focus on the learning rather than the exam performance. If we do this, the students should be more confident in their knowledge and understanding and be able to apply them in the assessments. This approach will be vital if we're to prepare students for employment when they finish their T-level programme. It's also been proven that this approach creates autonomous learners, able to perform better, to problem solve, and to have a broader knowledge base, and they're going to use that in the industry. So as we progress through today's training event, please keep this in mind. Please remember that we shouldn't be focused on producing students who can pass assessments. They should be able to confidently apply their knowledge and understanding of the topic to the context of the Education and Childcare T-level subject area, and this is vital also to create employable professionals by the end of the programme. Okay, moving on, we're going to have some rhetorical questions for your consideration to help you to review your students' learning and support needs and how they might help teachers and students prepare for the technical qualifications assessments. So, how aware are your students of their weaknesses and development areas? We've broken these down into different subject areas now. Firstly, subject specific. Are there any areas in particular that they are weaker and stronger in? Are they keeping a record of the knowledge and understanding they're developing on the course? Has there been any input or learning missed because of the pandemic? Are teachers and students aware of their individual progress and development needs? English, because exam reading and writing skills and competencies are different skills to everyday reading and writing. If they have limited exam experience, is there a plan for them to be developed and practiced on the programme? For the Employer Set project, have the students used the performers to practice and develop their reading and writing skills in context? And dealing with and overcoming assessment nerves. And although some stresses can be helpful to bring out our best performance, students do need to know how to deal with this and manage them effectively. Also, the new Employer Set project assessment structure might create new concerns for both the students and the teachers. So we will look at these in more detail in today's session. Managing the time, and this is both for revision activities and of course during the actual assessment tasks too. This is where practice can be really useful. We've already talked about revision strategies briefly. Which do the students know of, and do they know how to use them effectively? And has your curriculum been planned with this in mind? For self-regulation and autonomy in work, they need to be able to work independently, and this could be an area which the pandemic has helped some students. But do your students know how to do this effectively? Also, levels of confidence are important, especially when it comes to potentially stressful assessment situations. How can teachers develop their students' confidence in relation to preparing them for the exams in Esp? What can they include in teaching and learning activities to build the students' self-confidence? And of course, using the placement experience to reinforce learning, apply the theory to practice and allow the students to make sense of the learning they are experiencing in the classroom and in virtual and independent learning activities. And then reviewing best practice in relation to preparing the students for placement and reflecting upon their industry learning experiences would also encourage teachers to analyse this and review how well they are using the industry placements in relation to best practice and of course getting the maximum benefit out of them. Janet, can I bring you in here for the other and miscellaneous section to ask if there's anything else which is more subject specific or that I might have missed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there will be some elements, this core being made up of 12 elements. There's going to be some elements, topics, and so on that students may find trickier than others. And making sure that each student is able to confidently reflect on their own knowledge and understanding. It's creating that environment where students reflect openly, where they question openly about the aspects that they feel unsure of. And what about the resources that are available within the teaching and learning environment that will help students to sort of increase their knowledge on particular elements? And also thinking about the Employer Set project, the ESP, remember the importance of confidence with discussion. It's not an easy skill for some, and so practice here is also required to develop that confidence level. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thanks, Jan. And just before we move on, we've got a really good question that's come in that I'd like to put to you if we can. Thanks for the question. I would like it to be considered how the support or feedback will be consistent across centres for the ESP, with it only being supervised and only needing to be uploaded at the end of the project. What's your thoughts on that, Janet?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? And I think we'd be in a better place regarding standardization and benchmarking and leveling and so on if we'd gone through, a truer pilot situation, shall we say, this year. But what we will be doing is obviously the examiners will work with the principal examiner. They will standardize. They will look for their criteria, and within their sort of grading and final outcomes, there'll be so many processes that they will go through to ensure validity, to ensure that it's reliable. And how they will do that, I do not know, but they will follow a process, and they'll also be reflecting on sort of level 3 benchmarking from previous cohorts in similar qualifications. So it will be fair, it will be valid, it will be reliable, but the processes that they will actually go through to reach that will be through their own collaboration and standardization processes.
Thanks, Janet. That's great. Lovely. Okay, we're going to explore the summative assessment activities for E&C, starting with the core exam component. So this slide contains some important information, including dates, as well as the link to QualHub page for the up-to-date information regarding student support related to the exams. If you have planned to have all the core element contents delivered by Easter, you could choose the summer series for the first exam entry, and this would be booked at the point of registration. You can see the dates for the 2 exams just shown for confirmation on the slide, and which elements are covered in each exam. So we're aware that curriculum plans had elements starting being delivered in September. So if, for example, you started with element 1, 2, or theme 1 back in September, you'll need to, and you will have reconsidered and consider how formative assessments taken place to ensure that knowledge from the beginning of the programme was retained right through up until the exam dates in June. For the Employer SAP project, the assessment window is in May, and pre-release material should be shared with students up to 3 weeks before the first supervised assessment session. There's also a table here showing how the core and occupational specialism assessments are aggregated for the overall TQ grade. An example of this would be the student gaining a B grade for the core component and a merit grade for the occupational specialism. They would therefore aggregate to give an overall merit grade for the technical qualification. So that's just a quick reminder about how the core and occupational specialism grades come together to get that overall TQ grade. So the exams are designed to allow the students to put the theoretical knowledge they've gained into practice. Also to show the depth and breadth of their knowledge and understanding. So students should be encouraged to break down the exam questions, identifying what they are being asked to do with their knowledge and how to apply it to given scenarios. They should also focus on applying that core knowledge and analysing why they are making the professional, skilled decisions they are, being reflective and evaluative. T-levels attract the same UCAS points as 3A levels, but the biggest difference between the exams for both qualifications, that's T-levels and A-levels, is the expectation that T-level students will be able to apply the theory and knowledge to an industry context. Knowledge isn't gained in isolation. It relates directly to the industry, and students should be encouraged to do this themselves too. Okay, so now let's look at how the exam is structured. Each exam must align to 3 assessment objectives, which you can see on this table now. To summarise these, for assessment outcome 1, questions relate to knowledge and recall and the how things are done. This is most likely to be assessed via multiple choice type questions. For assessment outcome 2, questions build from AO1 and they require the students to apply their knowledge and understanding and also the why things are done in a certain way. This type of objective would probably be assessed via the short answer questions. And then finally, assessment outcome 3. These questions provide the opportunity for higher performance students to show their breadth and depth of knowledge, where they must also make evaluations and use their knowledge to make informed conclusions or judgments. Analysis and justification is required here, and we all know that different students will be able to do this to different levels. And this level of depth would probably be assessed via the extended answer questions. Linking back to the overall purpose of T-levels, the overall strategy requires a clear focus on application, analysis and evaluation to ensure that the students are independent and work ready. Janet, is there anything you want to add to that before we look at the questions in more detail?
I think what's important, just looking at what you've said really, Helen, in terms of these assessment objectives. So these are applied to the types of questions that the students will be given. And it's all about the depth and that sort of level of understanding. So with that assessment objective 1, the student is giving that sort of, what is this? They're almost defining something as the question develops. So if you're looking for things that are describing and explaining, for example, then you're adding maybe examples to show that you understand it in the context of education and childcare, and in relation, of course, to the question. And in assessment objective 3, you're digging that little bit deeper. So again, you're analysing and evaluating. You've done the definition, you've given an example, and you're thinking about some of those wider concerns and issues around it. And those will be typically allocated more points. But your students should be prepared for that, thinking about these are all strategies and techniques. Let's have a look at the question. Let's get familiar with the depth of the question and the requirements, therefore, of the answer, and having that sort of almost a bit of a plan, to give that student confidence. What are we talking about? How can we give an example of that to help describe or explain a situation if that's what the question's asking? And how can we talk about those wider things around it? What's going to go wrong if we don't do that? Can we compare this with something else? So yeah, I would just say being able to explore what these assessment objectives mean in the context of a range of different questions, and lots of practice around that. Thanks, Helen.
Excellent, thank you, Janet. So moving on to the students responding to questions, we're going to break this section up into the 3 different types of question. For multiple choice, there are a number of approaches that students could use. The first one being reading the choice question in its entirety before looking at the answer options. So there's an example on the screen now. Without the options there to choose from, does it make you think differently because the answer choices are not there? Can you try and answer it in your mind first by thinking about a number which might make sense or be appropriate? Think about what you already know. If we have a population in the UK of about 70 million, with approximately 7 million people of school age, how many of that 7 million would have an EHC plan? Multiple choice questions are more about eliminating the wrong answers, first of all. So here's the same question with some possible answers. In this example, using your assistant knowledge, we can probably discount A and B straight away. Is there either too low or too high? And then it's a process of elimination. The answer here is D for information, but just think about the process we've just briefly been through there to look at the question and consider what the answer might be, and then eliminating the ones that we think don't make sense. So teachers can use a range of sample questions to explore this process in more detail and increase a student's confidence in choosing the correct answer from their own knowledge base. This is something I know that a lot of centres are planning to do or doing already, asking students to write their own multiple choice questions. It does allow them to explore their existing knowledge when providing answer choices which might be correct, to get them thinking more deeply about topics, and of course more deeply about the actual answers of the question and what would make sense and what really doesn't. Other generic advice for MCQs could be to answer the questions they know first, and if they're not sure, they could then select the best answer they think from the options provided, or build their confidence to help them to make an informed guess. We've included the source for the data used for that sample question there. But to summarise, practice of writing and answering questions of this type is invaluable here, but be careful not to overdo this and create any assessment fatigue. Short, sharp activities and discussions about multiple choice questions, using engaging topics and interesting ideas, and having some fun also would be recommended here. So short answer questions do make up the majority of the core exams, so they're worth looking at in some detail. Students should remember that short answer questions require short answers. The marker is looking for very specific points in the answer, and it would be a huge waste of time to add extra information that's not needed or not asked for. So students should keep their answers concise and to the point. They should focus on hitting all the points they need to and give examples as and where appropriate. This next point is also useful to keep in mind. Students shouldn't ramble and to use the marks available for each question to inform what they write. 2 marks for a question normally means that they need to make 2 points, 3 marks for 3 points, etc. So encourage your students to apply this when they're answering this type of question. So reinforce what they should be showing in their answer. And in short answer questions, they are probably being asked to demonstrate and apply their knowledge and understanding. So that was AO2 in relation to the assessment outcomes. And then taking note of the important words and phrases in the question is also important. And then if they do that, they can actually rephrase the question's important terms in their answer. This should help to ensure they stay on topic and include the relevant points. So an example of this would be something like this example question shown here. The answer could simply rephrase the question, starting with, 2 main legislative acts which impact on are. And that's how they could look at the question, use the question text to formulate their answer and get them to practice doing that. Okay, and the final and most probably daunting type of question for students is the extended answer question. The first point I'd like to make here is that the students will be most likely to be including analysis, evaluation, whilst also making judgments. These are skills which will probably need to be supported and developed in a constructive and structured way. Students practicing this remotely or in centre would be appropriate and a good idea, whilst also supporting them to carry out self and maybe peer reviews of their own and each other's work and answer. So this sample question provides the scenario and sets the student a task to analyse the use of a reflective cycle in relation to the context. If the student doesn't know where to start, they could practice using the question wording to form their answer. So an example of this here, they could start off by explaining how Mohammed would use the stages of the cycle, as applying the theory to a scenario should also allow the student to go into and analysing its effectiveness and make more sense of it by using the key words in the question. So, for example, the name, the details regarding the work context and the course being studied will make the answer more real and easier for the student to write about and therefore go on to analyse. Question for you. How confidently do your students, are they able to write in an analytical or evaluative way? They may need support to do this, and reviewing answers they've produced is one way to get started. And some detailed input on this type of higher level writing might also be needed. So please have this in mind when you're planning your teach and learn activities in relation to preparing for the exams. But a point that Janet's made on many previous occasions relates to the ability, if you like, to analyse and evaluate. If they're not able, please do encourage them to respond to these questions using these lower level action verbs. They'll still gain some marks for doing this in the exam, so please encourage it. And we should also remember that for written answers, there are also marks for the quality of the written work. So encourage careful proofreading and checking for mistakes. Janet, have I missed anything on any exams that you could bring in?
I don't think you've missed anything, Helen, but just to sort of expand on what you've already said, I think, you know, when we're thinking about an exam, we do, especially at this time, have to bear in mind that exams, as I said at the beginning, have been incredibly rare, if existent at all. So we need to be mindful of that. And I think it's important that the preparation involves almost gaining some familiarity with what the question paper might look like. So looking at some examples and then also exploring those different types of questions and almost giving students a little bit of a strategy in terms of, right, how am I going to approach these questions? Am I always going to think about the what? Am I then going to think about an example? When I'm asked to analyze, then I need to give to do all of those, define, give an example, think about the wider picture, and lots of examples of that. And whilst it's good that we do that through written, because obviously they're going to have to write these answers at the end of the day, I think it's also important that we remember that these students may not have a clue what the word analyze means or what the word evaluate means. They've not used that at all. They've not used it in context, without a shadow of a doubt, perhaps. So it's arguably a good idea to also have plenty of discussion. So when you're in group works, when you're thinking about the tasks that you're setting students to do, to think about, okay, that's a really good example of an analysis, and then unpick it for them, show them how familiar that to reach an analysis can be. So I think it's about turning the unfamiliar to a familiar, but also doing it through discussion and through that reaffirmment of understanding, as well as practicing the papers where those words may never ever resonate with individuals. Thanks, Helen.
Lovely, thanks a lot, Janet. Okay, so that's the TQ exams covered. A quick reminder to add any questions you have in the question box, and we'll move on to the employer set project. One positive thing our 2020 starts have told us is how much they liked the employer set project. The process of completing it reinforced the knowledge and understanding needed to work in the industry, and the students really understood applying the core knowledge into a real-life context in completing the project brief. Students who had not much or any placement experience were still able to complete it, and they enjoyed doing so. So it's the opportunity in a real-life project to put the knowledge and understanding that they've been learning in the core into practice. That's how I would suggest you sort of sell it and explain it to your students. We're going to look at a step-by-step guide at the employer set project now. This 12-hour project is made up of 4 distinct tasks, and some of those tasks contain multiple elements. There are 3 contextualized versions of the ESP, and the students will complete the version they are planning on completing their occupational specialism in. But don't worry if they change their mind before starting year 2 of the programme. They can do this. They can do the EYE ESP, but then do assistant teaching for their specialism. So this slide is going to provide a step-by-step guide to the ESP tasks, and we'll look at each stage separately after this overview. So the ESP starts with a student research-based activity that will be based on a pre-release project information. They'll be provided with some information about a child or young person on which to base their research, which should be focused on collating information and materials that they've received during their learning throughout the qualification, which can include any information pertinent to the contextualized version of the assessment, for example, early years foundation stage or EYFS. This information, the students should collate information and refine it and focus it on the details that are contained in that pre-release activity ahead of the scheduled supervised assessments. The pre-release activity can be shared with students 3 weeks before the first supervised assessment session, which should only be scheduled to take place within the relevant assessment series window. So task 1A requires the students to create an early support or intervention plan based on the pre-release information and the project brief. This is completed under supervised conditions and will be completed using the students' prepared notes from the research. They will not be allowed access to the internet or any additional materials during that supervised time. There is a time limit of 3 hours for that task, and then the outcome of that activity would be a word processed plan. Task 1B then requires the students to produce an activity plan based on the plan they produced for task 1A. Again, this is to be completed under supervised conditions and under the same restrictions related to the internet and additional materials as task 1A. The time allowed for this task is also 3 hours, and the outcome would be the word processed activity plan. The timings for both of these tasks cannot be split up into smaller chunks. So the next task is based on student group discussion and peer review. For 2A, it's important to note that students must not start this task until all students in the cohort have completed task 1. Tutors will assign students to peer discussion groups, and each group should be made up of between 3 and 5 students. And the students are going to be reviewing the activity plans of the others in their group and complete a pro forma in preparation for that. For task 2, part 1, the students are then asked to submit their review of each other's activities plans produced in task 1B. They will then have the opportunity to amend their plan based on the peer feedback before handing it back to the tutor for review, and there's no time limit for that task. Moving on to 2A part 2, the students then carry out the group discussion about their activity plans. Students will have hard copies of the group's activity plans and their own completed pro formas, but it's important to note here that they will not be allowed to make any changes to their plan during this time. There's 20 minutes supervised preparation time to allow the students to read through each other's plans and formulate ideas and feedback on each other's in the group. And during this discussion, the tutors are required to ensure that every student participates and provides feedback. This might mean providing some prompts, so tutors may also need to have copies of the forms that the students are using available to them too. Each student will have a maximum of 5 minutes to present their plan, and then each student is to provide feedback and discuss the presenter's plan. And notes related to this discussion and feedback should be taken and recorded on the pro forma by each of the students. And then for task 2B, students will review the feedback they've received and make changes to improve their plan. This must be completed under supervised conditions, and it has a time limit of a maximum of an hour. So then task 3 is based on a discussion with a tutor. And for 3A, the students will use their early support plan and updated activity plan to prepare for the discussion with the tutor. The students should have no more than 2 hours to prepare for this task, and the beginning of the discussion should cover both of the plans. The tutor will then ask questions about the plans, and this should last no longer than 10 minutes per student. So in task 3B, the tutor should take the role of a workplace supervisor, for example, a key worker or a teacher, and have a professional discussion about the approach the student took, exploring the rationale behind it. I call this a role play type discussion. It also requires the tutor to assess the student's verbal communication skills, and there is a pro forma and guidance table for you to use for that. And then finally, for task 4, the student will work under supervised conditions to reflect on the tasks they've completed, review their project work in direct relation to the project brief they got at the start of the supervised session. And they're also allowed 2 hours for that task. To summarise, therefore, all the tasks here are based on the early support or intervention plan and activity plan that the students create. It's a case of looking at each other's, reviewing each other's, presenting theirs to their peers, taking feedback and answering questions about their plan, and then using that feedback to update and improve the plan as appropriate. And then talk to a teacher. It doesn't say, the guidance doesn't say which teacher. It can be a teacher that's been involved in the delivery of the programme. Discussing it with them as if they were in a real life industry context. Talking about it, justifying it, and then reflecting on how well the whole project met the project brief. So we'll now look at each of the ESP tasks in greater detail and make some suggestions for teaching and learning activities. So the pre-release material should be shared with students 3 weeks before the assessment window, the date shown on the screen now. And please remember to check how this fits in with your centre Easter time closures. We recommend you use the sample materials to help prepare the students for the task. So here's the example for early years educator that's currently available on QualHub. Students should be encouraged to read and discuss the project briefs, explore what's there and what's not there, and where they might focus their research based on this pre-release activity material. For this example, this might include what level of progress a 37-month-old child would be expected to have made, and what factors might have impacted on the child's progress in this context. This bullet point list shows what the student must consider, so it would make sense to practice using those bullet points as factors to research in relation to the given scenario. Jana, what would you pick out specifically from this pre-release material to inform the research activities?
Okay, so straight away, I think what we do is remember what's being tested. What's being tested in that employer set project is taken from those 12 elements. So first of all, we're thinking, what are those 12 elements? How can we apply it? And how can we break that down and apply it in the context of this particular study? So thinking about the age, thinking about a specific area or focus of need or interest, and relating this then to normative patterns of development. What can we learn from the early years foundation stage about or development matters or birth to five? What can we learn from that? What about the national curriculum if we're thinking about assisting teaching and any associated relevant legislation? Is it relevant to think of partnership working here? Is it relevant to think about how children are learning and how they're learning through a playful environment, how they're learning through a more sort of structured key stage 1 and above environment? So obviously thinking about those 12 elements, thinking about what those 12 elements are, and then contextualizing how can I bring that out? Because at the end of the day, that's what's being tested. So don't come too far away from what's being tested. This will be an application of knowledge and understanding from that core learning. So always go back to that as your base and then think about, okay, so what from those elements makes sense and is relevant to be applied in context to this particular project. And that will then help to sort of give that breadth of knowledge and understanding application. And then you're looking at that sort of in a more granular way, looking at the detail, the age, the stage, the needs of the child, the interests of the child, any curriculum requirements, parents, approaches, that sort of thing. Thanks, Helen.
Great, so students are going to submit the research materials to the tutor before the cohort's first supervised session, and this is to allow it to be reviewed by a teacher and amended if required. So this is another area they could practice and receive feedback on to develop their academic reading and research skills and confidence. But remember, students should not have access to the project tasks until the research notes have been approved by their tutor. And please just a reminder to refer to the tutor guidance for more information about that. So moving on to task 1A, the creation of an early support or intervention plan. The students will use their notes and the extra information in the project brief to do this under supervised conditions and in the first 3-hour window. So the EYE sample brief is on the screen now. The live project brief would be given to the students at the start of the first supervised session. Students should practice reviewing this extra information and how their research activities that they've completed apply to it, which bring in areas for teaching and learning. So students should be encouraged to review how relevant their research is to the extra information provided here. Have they predicted how the project was going to develop accurately? Have the bullet points on the pre-release information guided them effectively? Teachers will need to support these research and note-taking skills, helping them to apply their knowledge to the context effectively. And students could be asked to create their own pre-release and project briefs using examples from their own experiences, personally or from placement, ensuring that all personal information is anonymised, obviously. And self-assessment and peer review activities would be really helpful here too. Janet, is there anything subject specific that you could bring in as well here, please?
I think just remembering that what we're looking at here is child-centeredness, young person-centered, depending on the context. Identified professional intervention. What's your own role within this? What about partnership working, curricula, any development links you can think of here? And then the student thinking about, what is this situation? What's it telling me about this child? Are there key features that are relevant here? What are the priorities? What resources would you need? Do we need to apply differentiation? And then revisit the what with the why and the how. So you're actually giving time to structure those responses. So that sort of what, why, and how being very important across all questions, whether that's an exam or an employer set project, and about making sure students are aware that, these 12 elements are being tested through this. Some are going to be more applicable than others. Let's think about what's applicable. Let's think about how they're applicable and then break those down into the context.
Absolutely. So applying the core element coverage that you'll have been doing in the last 5-6 months or so, and how each of the elements relate to this brief, to this child,
Absolutely.
to the learner specifically. Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
So task 1B continues on from 1A by using the student's early intervention or support plan to create an activity plan, and this must be a separate supervised session to task 1A. With the students being supervised and then completing the task independently, they're probably going to need practice doing this. Using an early support or intervention plan and the project brief information to create their action plans. So having a range of completed plans for review could introduce this task nicely, with the students reviewing what makes a good plan and how they could ensure they include this learning in production of their own plans. What would be really good practice here would to be make it real by using the students' experience and ideas as the basis of a project brief and creating plans for anonymised real children or young people. Practice completing the performers would obviously also be beneficial. And for those students who are lucky enough to have started their placements, getting example plans from them or asking the placement colleagues for input or guidance would also be very useful. So similar to students creating their own questions, exam style questions, they could also create a brief, some pre-release material, an example of what they might be using in real for the assessment here in their practice and activities. We'll move on to task 2 now, and task 2 in general focuses on that peer review and discussion about the students' plans. And to start this, tutors will assign the peer groups, so it might be useful to consider the room or space available and cohort sizes when determining the number of students within a group. You'll also need to keep this manageable, ensure group sizes are appropriate, and I know I've had some discussions with some centres about who they're going to put with who works better with who's going to be more supported or more stretched, and who's going to be with who in which group. So the students will need to be provided with their group's plans and the peer group discussion preparation form, which you can see on the screen now. It is available on QualHub. In relation to teaching and learning tips, we're going to use the sections of this form to guide us. So each student must review what's in their peers' plans, and this might need to be supported via classroom or remote learning activities. As mentioned on the previous slide, with example plans to review and for discussion, and to get the students used to analysing the work and ideas of others. This might be straightforward for some, but very challenging or difficult for others. Reviewing the work of their peers does not come easily for all 16-year-olds. So a safe space or environment to practice doing this could be built into your ESP preparation activities, which moves us on nicely to providing feedback to their peers. And again, this might not be easy for all students, depending on their level of subject knowledge and, of course, confidence. Providing constructive and development feedback is a skill, which some 16-year-olds may need to develop. Think of student management and developing their ability to be reflective, positive and constructive in a professional and developmental manner. Practice doing this would be beneficial for all students in preparing from the ESP. So now let's look at some specific sections of this form. The first asks the students to identify an area of strength from each plan and to justify why they think it would work well. So this requires a high level of thinking and evaluation. So developing this competency will be beneficial in your teaching and learning activities. The second question here asks the students to identify one question they will ask each of their peers Again, that's a high-level skill and should be focused on the design of the plan and the rationale behind it. Developing this skill in your teaching and learning might be needed using examples and discussion activities. And then this final question relates to providing an example of how the plan could be improved. Thinking about your current students, how many of them could confidently and accurately do this? How could you bring in these activities into your teaching practice? And again, I'm going to hand over to Janet for some subject-specific input now.
Thanks, Helen. I think just going back to what you've said and reflecting on that a moment, peer learning and peer feedback is powerful, but it's not easy. And students, of course, will benefit from practice, as you said. They need to be fully engaged with the role that they have and fully involved with the criteria and understand the importance of constructive feedback. So you could practice using the step-by-step approach during classroom activities to prepare for this. What's the criteria? What's the aim of this task? What are we trying to get from it? And how does the student response meet this? Explain how, what has the student done well? What could be answered better? Making at least one recommendation. In this way, students will become a little bit more familiar with constructive feedback, how to give it, and of course, how to receive it too. So it's powerful, but it's not easy. And I think, you know, discussion and using discussion and feedback is an absolute metacognitive skill. However, it's also an unfamiliar skill. We've got to remember that. So being placed into groups when those groupings are so significant takes a lot of careful thought. Thanks, Helen.
Okay, lovely. So for 2A Part 1, just for clarifications, tutors will need to give students printed versions of the relevant Task 1B activity plans for each of the students in their group, along with copies of the preparation for peer discussion pro forma. So this pro forma must be completed under supervised conditions and students must work independently. All completed forms need to be handed into the tutor, who will be asked to review the completed forms to ensure there is sufficient detail to allow access to peer feedback during the discussion. And verbal feedback to students can be provided if there are areas for development, but advice regarding the specific omissions or improvement should not be given. Guidance here could include questions or comments such as, "You haven't said why you think that aspect of the plan worked well. Your question doesn't relate to how and why the others designed their plans the way they did. And how do you think that would improve the plan?" So it's just digging into those bits a bit deeper so it's more reflective and more evaluative. So the students will take part in a group discussion and then will be required to complete the student feedback form, which you can see on the screen now. Every student must participate, present their activity plan, discuss it and answer questions related to it, their approach and ideas. So for teaching and learning, some students will be more confident than others in relation to presenting their plan and justifying their approach. Looking at the sections of this form in more detail, this first question asks about the feedback received related to what about their plan their peers thought would work well. And this might need to be developed with support by structure in classroom or virtual activities, which highlight the strengths in some sample action plans. So the questions they were asked about their plans forms the basis of this next part of the form. And the tutor guidance does not state when this form should be completed, so it might be useful for the students to have this form to hand during the discussion so that they can make some notes here to remind them later. Teachers might also develop the students' understanding of the different types of question they might ask and how to structure questions constructively and professionally. And then this final section here provided relates to how their plan could be improved. All of these questions will help to develop the students' critical thinking skills, so they would benefit from practicing these in a supported and structured way by their T-level teachers, and not just come across this activity for the first time in the actual assessment. So for 2B, the students will then review the feedback they've received and make changes to improve the plan. This must be completed under supervised conditions and within 1 hour. I'm going to start off this section by referring to the picture on the screen now. In relation to a teaching and learning approach, I'd suggest that developing the students' approach to inspire each other to do the best work they possibly can would be brilliant. Encourage them to strive for best practice, have very high expectations of each other, and really focus on producing the best possible action plan that they can. So using the feedback they've received and personal reflections, students must now update and improve their own plan. They're required to also have a summary of their changes, making direct references to the peer feedback they received. All of these activities might require input from teachers to allow the students to confidently and effectively complete this task. And reviewing activity plans and sample reflections and improvements would help students to understand how this would be done. And so obviously structuring activities around this is going to be useful. We've put an example on the screen now, a completed example. If this was the level of detail included on their form, would it be sufficient for a student to complete this task? What type of detail is needed to support completion of this task? So again, practice and doing this is going to be useful for all students. It'll help them apply theory to practice and develop their understanding of being a reflective practitioner, and obviously develop their confidence in relating to completing the ESP tasks. Janet, over to you again for some ideas, please.
Thank you. I think just going back to that advice that's kind of been at the core and central to this webinar, practice, practice, practice. And I know we know that, but reflection is a serious business and it's a demanding skill. So if peer feedback given during practice is followed by a breakdown approach, such as reflecting on what went well, how the feedback will support improvement, action planning to make those improvements, this will all help give a little bit of structure, help that familiarity so that students are beginning to understand, well, what is reflection? Even if we don't know how to do it, we know what it is and what's involved. And that's important. And also bearing in mind, keeping at the forefront all the criteria that task 2 in its various forms is going to require when you're actually planning for this, so that the students have got the bigger picture of what the employer set project, and in particular task 2, is aiming to achieve. Thanks, Helen.
So the next task is that tutor discussion about the plan. And the students have 2 hours to prepare for this. And the tutor guidance does make reference to a pro forma for this, and the guidance related on how students could structure their preparation is on page 8 of the ESP pro forma document. So we'd suggest using these headings that are in bold, and of course the bullet points, to plan what they're going to say in this discussion. So for teaching and learning tips, it would make sense to also use this guidance to help them to produce their plan, as they make reference to the educational theories underpinning their plan, a review of their communication skills and how the approach used met the project brief, concepts which should be brought in at the planning stage rather than wait until now. And I've said this is kind of a role play activity where the teacher takes on the role of an industry professional and discussing the activity plan as if it was for a real child or young person. A tip here, therefore, would be to make it as real as possible. In a one-to-one setting, expecting the level of detail, justification and professionalism the student would be expected to provide in a work context. And then task 3B is the actual discussion with the teacher. The teacher can ask prompt questions, but like I said earlier, they shouldn't offer any suggestions or introduce any new information. And this is to support the students' evaluative and reflective skills and readiness for the next and final task. So example questions tutor might find are useful or use are contained in the tutor guidance document on QualHub, as can be seen on the screenshot shown on the slide now. And as with other tasks, practicing this is going to be useful, but it's also important to note that we ask tutors to assess the students' communication skills here. So it might be useful and beneficial if you share which communication skills you'll be assessing with your students to facilitate developing these if needed. And these are higher level speaking and listening skills, so please don't assume that all students have these competencies already. So the final task is reflection on the project and review of how well it met the brief. There are no proformas for this, but as this subject forms the basis of element 9 in the core, we're looking in the fact that reflective models are taught as part of the core. So you might have templates for the different reflective models already, and you could support students and activities which allow them to practice using them, and this will also embed and consolidate using reflective models. Janet, any other teaching and learning tips that you could share with us, please?
I think just to say in that preparation, following cycles of reflection, as you've just mentioned, Helen, and making these in context to the scenarios, to the students' own learning, following feedback and using models to create a methodical approach. Think what the stages mean if you're linking to a specific approach, and follow that. Use these cycles often as part of formative learning, so that again, reflection relates to a step-by-step approach, and it's not a theory that they may not feel they can relate to. So always practicing, always thinking about what does that theory mean? How can we use it in practice? And like, I think you mentioned, Helen, about not doing something for the first time in an actual task. So I think it's important, to really make sure that students are as familiar with applying the models of reflection as they can be.
Great, thanks for that, Janet. So all the documents the students will complete for the ESP are available on Qual Hub, and as we've said throughout today's session, we do suggest that students practice completing these using scenarios from their placement or personal experiences. Also asking the students to create their own pre-release information and project briefs for others to complete and review. This will allow them to prepare for the ESP whilst also making clear links of theory to practice, which will reinforce the learning of the knowledge and understanding of the core. So for early years educator and supporting and mentoring students, there's an early support plan pro forma available for you to use. And for assistant teaching, there's the same for the intervention plan. And then this is the pro forma for all specialisms to use as the activity plan. We've already mentioned some of the strategies you could be used to prepare students for this activity. So we'll now summarize these for you. So research shows that practicing improves success. Exploring the type of activities the students will be asked to complete in the industry would be a good place to start. On a more generic note, teachers could also explore project planning with students and discuss how to manage their time for this type of project. Using the correct language, terminology, and a professional tone might also need to be developed or practiced. And then looking at, analysing and evaluating completed plans would be useful too, in groups, pairs and individually. Exploring what makes a good activity plan could be useful. And although this assessment activity is designed to assess knowledge, real examples from placement and discussion of their success would help to put that theory into practice. Pairing students up to share placement experience and facilitate peer learning and preparation for this would also be useful. And as we've already mentioned, we've got the pro forma, so students using them would be very useful. You could also have some completed examples for discussion and review with models of good and bad practice to develop the students' understanding of what will be expected of them, both in the industry and for this task. Group discussions, something we've already mentioned to support learning, but having specific discussions which mirror the ESP discussions are going to be useful in building the students' skills and confidence. And you can have some fun with some role play here, with students even acting as the tutor and vice versa for some of them. And I know reflective practice is included in the core, so an extension activity of an extension of the learning activities being facilitated to include specifics related to the ESP are going to be useful. They could carry out practice ESP tasks using different models of reflection to consolidate learning and develop their confidence, which brings me to my final point here. Consider how much support or guidance is required for your students to be objective and evaluative. Confidence in these areas generally comes with practice and experience, so teachers need to plan specific activities which support the development of skills and confidence levels in these areas. Being objective, supporting students to not give or take criticism personally, and phrasing their feedback to each other in a positive and professional manner might be something some or all of your students would benefit from here. practice again in a safe and supportive environment is best practice. And Janet, miscellaneous for you to bring in anything else from your subject-specific perspective, please.
I think you've summed up everything really well. I would just say, remember that the knowledge and understanding that those students have at their fingertips from your excellent teaching, from the resources and the inspiring learning, it's massive. But the more familiar the requirements of the tasks are, the more prepared the student will feel. So contextualize to the assessment through coverage of teaching and learning in classroom activities, and use the example questions to explore knowledge and understanding and to reflect, to think about requirements, to think about those different types of questions, and don't underestimate other skills such as discussion, feedback, reflection. Thanks, Helen.
I've just checked the question box and we don't have any, but that doesn't mean you still haven't got time to pop them in there. So I know we're slightly overrunning now. We've just gone over the hour. So I'm going to go to the last poll, but still encourage you to put any questions in. The question at the end here now is, after attending the session, using the same grading system as before, how do you now rate your confidence level in preparing students for the TQ core assessments? So 1 being low and 10 being high. Where would you put yourself now after attending the session, please? And straight away, we've got people in the 9 to 10s, so that's wonderful, great to see. It's the industry has not changed because we have new assessment methods. How things are assessed is being guided. How the skills and knowledge and competencies and understanding is assessed has been guided by the industry. So that's why we have these new assessment methods. But as I say, from last year, the centres who did these really got a lot out of them, and the students really felt that they were able to demonstrate their learning from that academic year in practice. So please feel very positive that you can absolutely prepare your students for these new assessment methods. I'll just give it another minute or two just to allow everyone to vote. We're at 71%, so we're nearly there. Thanks for that. Janet, anything you want to say just to
While people are finishing there, I'd just say, well,
yeah,
thanks for coming onto the webinar. And obviously, when things are out of our control, and exams are all that like that, aren't they? External assessment is like that, but this is a celebration of all that excellent teaching and learning. So now, are there any ways that we can equip students with in the best way possible to apply that knowledge and understanding? Yes, there are ways that you can prepare your students, and thinking about some of these key things, different types of questions, understanding and being familiar with reflection, understanding and being familiar in terms of giving and receiving constructive feedback, and having a bit of a formula to help with that, really useful in preparation.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm just sharing the poll results there, just to clarify where we're at. So thanks everybody for listening and participating today. So thank you, much appreciated. So we've reached the end of the session. We do have an evaluation form which will be available automatically as you log out of today's session. Please do take a minute to complete it for us, as we do use the feedback to adapt our sessions and approach and to ensure that we are meeting your needs as our providers. I'm going to say many thanks for your attendance and input. Janet, I'm going to leave the final words to your good self. So from myself, until next time, please stay safe and well.
Thanks, Helen, and absolutely echoing that. Take good care of each other. Your students will be fine because you will give them the information that they need. Enjoy this. It's a celebration of of the sector. That's all I've got to say. Thank you. Thanks, Helen. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. And I'll just keep the question box open for the moment. If anybody does have anything at all, please feel free to pop it in.